You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 12th of March 2025 on Monocle Radio.
Will Russia agree to a ceasefire? And should anybody trust it if it does? Has the EU finally figured out a formula on migration which will deflate the continent's populists? And what's the worst dining car food you've ever eaten? I'm Andrew Mueller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Mueller. My guests Julia Lassica and Vincent McAvaney will discuss the day's big stories, and our On This Day historical series will reflect on how one country narrowly avoided calamity when it came to naming its capital. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Mueller, and I am joined today by Monocle writer Julia Lassica and by Vincent McAvaney, journalist and Monocle Radio regular politics commentator. Hello to you both.
Hello.
Hi.
Vincent, helpfully, your recent doings will foreshadow an item we will be talking about later in the show.
Seamless link. Yes, we're going to be talking a little bit later about Netflix and its impact on literature and adaptations. But I was actually...
No spoilers.
Oh, sorry. I was actually this weekend at the reverse of this, which was the Stranger Things play, which has been adapted from the TV show that's had sort of 4 successful seasons, 1 more to go. It's been the sort of second biggest hit, I think, after the South Korean show, Squid Game, that was it. But this has been something that Netflix has done, which is sort of branching out, taking its own property, its own IP, putting it on the stage in a way that really only sort of Disney does in its attempt to sort of become that sort of dominant media player of the 21st century.
Is it good, and did you enjoy it?
I really enjoyed it. The special effects are spectacular. It's incredible what they managed to do on the stage. I think it definitely, you could go not having seen the show, but I think you'll get a lot more out of it if you are a fan of the show, because it ties in some quite clever ways.
And Julia, I have 2 words to say to you. They are Stroud and Green.
Yes, exactly. So that's where I've moved to. That's where my new flat is. And that's all I've been doing. I've been doing no cultural things, no fun things, no travelling, just moving into my new flat.
We won't blame you for that, because moving into a new abode is one of the most time-consuming and tedious and yet ideally ultimately rewarding things a person can do. But Stroud Green, and this is no shade on your new neighbourhood, it is a mere statement of fact, is not the most heralded of London's locales. So what are you enjoying about it so far? How would you tempt people to Stroud Green?
Okay, well, I love it. So when I walk along my road, I can see on both sides of me, like there's a really deep view down into London, so the City and the Shard and St. Paul's, all of that beautiful like skyline glittering on one side. And then on the other side, I can see down a valley and up at Alexandra Palace. So you've got just these spectacular views and the most gorgeous, Georgian, Edwardian, etc. Townhouses that have been preserved so beautifully, and it's just such a joy to walk around.
I used to live not far from Alexandra Palace myself, on Alexandra Park Road. In fact, it is an undervalued institution in London because it's insane. It's just one of those buildings you look at and think, how on earth did that get there? But you're kind of glad it did.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, that commercial for Stroud Green brought to you by Julia. But we will start the show with Russia, in whose court the ball is now in, at least according to US Secretary of State Marco Rubio, following yesterday's presentation of a US-Ukraine ceasefire proposal. The pitch is an immediate 30-day ceasefire. In return for Ukraine going along with it, the US ended the pause on intelligence sharing and security assistance it had announced a few days previously. The longer-term idea appears to be negotiations between Ukraine and Russia, also involving Ukraine's European partners, and Ukraine forging some sort of commercial partnership with the United States vis-a-vis its mineral resources. Julia, I cannot begin to imagine, well, I could say this about the last 3 years, but I cannot begin to imagine what the last couple of weeks have been like for you and your fellow Ukrainians. Have you yet figured out whether the United States is actually on your side or not?
No one has. It's a big unknown, I think. And I think this is is what's scary, is that now, like you said, the ball is in Putin's court. He's on the hook. The pressure is all on him. What's he going to do next? How is he going to act? What is he going to drag out these talks? Is he going to get any concessions that we just won't stand for? And what happens to Europe in all of this as well? I mean, we're speaking from London, and what happens to us here as well in the kind of relatively safer countries? So I think it's all very uncertain, and this feeling of uncertainty is just horrible, not knowing whose side America is on anymore.
I mean, are there causes, Vincent, here for optimism, do you think? I mean, a 30-day ceasefire would, in the short term at least, stop quite a lot of people getting killed on both sides who might otherwise get killed, which is, on balance, surely a good thing. But looking beyond that, there are possibly reasons to be concerned?
Yeah, I think there are real concerns because whilst, Ukraine has sort of done these talks in Saudi Arabia, they've gone on for hours, they've come up with a possible plan and are trying to be pragmatic after that disastrous meeting in the Oval Office. Really, we've not seen much of any pressure at all applied on Russia whatsoever. No condemnation, really giving away a lot of the negotiating ground before the negotiations had even started. Donald Trump, yesterday he was posing as a used car salesman outside the White House with some Teslas. That remarkable line when he got inside and said, "It's all computer." It just shows how disconnected this person is from real life. He just doesn't seem to want to in any way help sort of not just with the situation as it is, but also the emboldenment of Vladimir Putin. This can't be seen by Vladimir Putin as being a win, as that him sort of testing the fences and succeeding once again and leaving Europe in greater threat. So we'll see how the Kremlin responds to this. But at the moment, it does feel like the heat has all been on Ukraine, and we'll see whether or not Vladimir Putin manages to get under Donald Trump's skin so much. If he realizes he's being played by him, then he might snap at him and might come back into the fold with Europe. But at the moment, it would be hopeful if we could have at least a little cessation of the fighting, given the escalation in the past week of these overnight attacks. It's good that the intelligence is being switched back on for Ukraine, but it's unclear yet what Russia will actually do.
Julia, President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine appears to have put more on the table than he previously had. He had spoken before about a ceasefire in the air and at sea. This, as I understand it, would include fighting on the ground as well, which is where most of the fighting has happened. This deal by which the United States would benefit commercially from exploiting Ukraine's mineral reserves, rather, appears to be back on. But do you get the sense that Zelensky perhaps might have managed to assert himself here a little bit, or perhaps even that he's just finding Marco Rubio easier to deal with than Donald Trump, which I grant is a low bar?
Yes, so I think, he wasn't present yesterday at the official talks. I think he was sort of linked in via an intercom or something. He was guiding his team, which was led by Yermak, the head of his office. I think that what's happened here is that Ukrainians have been trapped in this bubble, which is what war does to you. When you're being attacked, all you can really think about is yourself and your pain, because you are in pain, and everyone's been in pain. They know how this feels. And there has been an unwillingness to use the language of the other side, of Russia, which is that, of a ceasefire, of stopping the fighting, because we know that Russia, and this is what Zelensky brought up and what led to the spat in the Oval Office, is Russia uses these ceasefires, and they've used them before, in Syria and Chechnya, etc., to regroup, gain strength, and then attack again. And then it's much more disastrous the second time round. So what's difficult is that Ukraine had to accept using this language. But I think now what happened after that Oval Office spat was suddenly the Ukrainians had to think, OK, we have to use this language in order to move forward with the US. It hurts for us to do this. It's denigrating, and it takes away from all the sacrifices that have been made. Families that have lost husbands and sons and women who've been killed as well. But we have to use that language because it exists in another world, in the peace world, that the US and Europe, etc. exist in. So Ukrainians have had to take this kind of peace talk, even though, of course, they're in a war situation.
But just to follow that up, Julia, and again, as we've discussed before, there's no one opinion in Ukraine any more than there is in any other country. But is there any kind of general consensus, do you think, on what is a plausible best case scenario from where we are now?
Yeah, So there have already been talks about military operators, logistics operators in Ukraine who are already drawing up plans for how we are going to rotate our troops. So the troops are exhausted. They haven't been rotated for 3 years now, which is inhumane, really. If you think about the kind of the wear and tear it has on the body and on the mind. Also, how will we produce more drones in the time that we have, the ceasefire? Also, working with Europeans on production inside Ukraine and also sharing Ukrainian sort of intelligence and understanding of weapons manufacturing, which because Ukraine has serious prowess in this area that Europe just doesn't have, the speed and the flexibility that they have, sharing this with the Europeans so they can also shore up their defences, especially in the instance in which the US starts to withdraw their troops. So I think that there's been this change, and I think that Ukrainians now can see, okay, how do we use this pause to our advantage? Because, you know, if that's what the US wants, and if they will withdraw, and we saw they did, military aid and intelligence, and that already had huge catastrophic
people
influence.
very plausibly died as a consequence of that.
They did, directly as a result. You know, the intelligence part of it was being used to see when the missiles were being launched and where they were heading, and we saw hotels being hit, we saw factories being hit. Also Ukraine's hold in Kursk was seriously degraded as a result of intelligence. The Ukrainian army was for a few days essentially blind. They couldn't see what was happening around them, and the Russians really used this to their advantage, and that's why some people have suspicions about why did this happen. Was Trump, in order somehow coercing Ukraine into giving up some cards, you know, Kursk, the foothold they have in Russia. So yes, it has to be seen as an opportunity if that's what has to happen.
Well, to Europe now, and to the rarely controversial matter of migration. The EU's difficulties with migration are by now well understood. The EU as a thing and most of its constituent governments have generally been keen on, or at least indulgent of, migration on both economic and compassionate grounds. However, a large enough cohort of the EU's actual people are unkeen enough that they vote in ever-increasing numbers for parties willing to take a much tougher line on migration and more besides. Accordingly, the EU is now floating a new plan which will streamline the processes associated with deportation and create so-called return hubs in non-EU countries. Vincent, here's a simple question. Is this going to work?
Well, I think it's necessary for the EU to look at this, because I think for too long, and we saw the repercussions in this country probably ahead of the rest of the EU with the rise of various parties and the Brexit movement, that if you ignore this and say it's not really happening and deny the reality of it, people get quite annoyed at you for that and they punish you. And then there's dealing with the issue as well. And you can end up in situations, and this is now a problem in the UK, where the aid budget, a substantial section of it has had to be diverted to housing people here in the UK who have come by the small boats route. So you're then losing out on money which, you know, is already a difficult sell sometimes to the taxpayer. You know, we've cut now from 0.7% of GDP in the UK to 0.3% in foreign aid. There's still some that say it should be cut further. But when that money is having to be spent here housing people who haven't been processed correctly, you're potentially not helping those that need it the most in terms of asylum from other regions, and you're sort of cutting funding to aid programs around the world. It just has such a complex effect that I think voters really do, and possibly rightly so now, not just to stop the rise of the right-wing parties, but to make sure aid budgets, don't entirely disappear, and then you've got chaos around the world, collapse of those systems, which have done so much to alleviate so much sort of absolute poverty.
It's that word chaos, which I still, when I'm trying to be optimistic about this, Julia, think is the important one. This is the idea that what voters actually dislike is not migrants in and of themselves, but the perception of anarchy, that there's no system, that nobody's in charge, and that such rules as there are not enforced. I mean, Ursula von der Leyen, EU Commission President, said herself today that of asylum seekers in Europe who have a return decision, which is to say their asylum request has been denied and they've been told they have to go home, only 20% of them actually leave Europe. So 4/5 of them who are told you have to go are still here, which isn't ideal.
No, and we've seen actually, I think, sadly, very shocking cases. I mean, I don't want to point any fingers at all here, but shocking cases where people are in this limbo and then they sort of lash out with violence. And it is very psychologically taxing. And also people who are awaiting decisions. You know, there's that horrible case of that huge ship, rusting ship being used somewhere in Scotland to house all those poor refugees who are waiting for this decision on their status. So it's very, very psychologically taxing. And I guess for the people around as well, you know, these people should be given the opportunity, if that is the case, to commit to society, to, you know, give back what they can and to I don't know, take an active role in life, because otherwise it's just too hard. But it is interesting, they want a sort of clear-cut decision now. And I think there was one of the changes is that they can only, so under the current rules, they can only deport asylum seekers back to their country of origin if they agree, whereas here it will be whether they agree or not. It's a sort of, they'll be given more draconian powers in order to deal with this. But I guess it seems natural as well. Why should they be agreeing whether or not they can be deported? Surely it's up to the EU to decide whether or not they accept them. But I don't know. I don't really understand. I don't know about the decision, how they make the decision on whether or not to keep asylum seekers in. So, anyway, that's a different one.
Because one of the ideas that this proposes for streamlining the thing, Vincent, is that EU countries will now be able to enforce each other's deportation orders.
Yeah, which makes sense if you are in the Schengen zone and it's completely borderless and you can kind of get around anywhere. Then it's surprising to me that this hasn't come into place already, that they can enforce each other's, given that they've got this sort of shared peripheral border and no internal borders in that zone.
The question then arises, Julia, whether any of this will calm down or win back a single, for example, AfD voter, because this does seem to be one of those issues which is completely impervious to facts. In the United States, for example, you can point out till you're blue in the face that more people were deported during Joe Biden's term than were deported during President Trump's first term. But that does not appear to persuade or indeed even interest anybody.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's an emotional issue. People just feel very angry about something, or they're using it as a sort of scapegoat for wider issues with how the European Union is run, the bureaucracy, the red tape, you know, certain people feeling left behind and underrepresented. So I don't really think it will have a huge impact on the way people are sort of geared up against the European Union and von der Leyen.
Because it is, just finally on this, Vincent, a thing we have seen time and time again, that those, what we might think of as respectable centre ground mainstream legacy parties take a harder line on immigration to try and win back some of their voters they have lost to the populists. But you can't get those people back, because whatever you propose, the populists, who are unlikely to ever actually be held accountable for any of this, will just say, well, we'll be even tougher.
Yeah, that's right. And it's really interesting. This past week, actually, Rishi Sunak has emerged and done his first interview since leaving Downing Street last summer as Britain's Prime Minister. And it's an extended 2-hour interviews. And one of the things he says is that he actually regrets some of the stuff that he did on this issue in office, particularly the stop the boats, which he said, I knew full well that whatever I did wasn't going to stop these boats from coming over. There was no way to stop them fully. We could try and reduce it. But he sort of did think that actually they had played too much into the hands of, in this country, Reform, which is a party which is trying to outflank the Conservatives, particularly just grasping this issue of immigration. What's really interesting, and it always sticks with me though, and we've seen that in the last week here in the UK. I remember years and years ago talking with Nick Clegg when I was interviewing him about then the rise of the BNP, and then we sort of had the rise of UKIP, and then we had the rise of the Brexit Party, then now Reform Party, and these sort of they're different parties, and obviously the BNP was a very extreme example. But what he says is that you traditionally in these single issue parties get so many kind of big personalities grabbing attention that the infighting normally collapses them, the lack of experience. And we're already seeing that with Reform in the UK. So it'll be interesting to see with the AfD, more time in opposition for them, particularly in Germany, whether or not there is infighting there, because we've seen it as well with the Pen family in France and the infighting that you used to get there, whether or not that sort of is the thing that actually does them down in the end.
Well, to further encouraging news from the world of rail, where there appears to be increasing enthusiasm for the idea of reviving its more civilised aspects. French railway concern SNCF, one of whose employees recently earned the applause of a grateful planet by fining a mannerless peasant who was broadcasting audio on his phone, has unveiled a new high-speed train which will include a buffet car and tables at which its produce may be consumed. The bad news is that said buffet, called Le Bistro, which translates as the bistro, will be literally that, i.e. self-service, rather than the liveried waiters which might have been preferred, but it's a start. Julia, are you enthused about the idea of a self-service buffet on a train?
All I could think about when I was reading the story is how messy it's going to get unless you have cleaners on hand to help people, because inevitably they're going to be really sloppy with putting their ready meals or whatever in the microwaves or serving themselves coffee. So that's all I could think about was, God, after 1 hour of use, what will be going on in there?
It does rather seem like one of those things, Vincent, where nobody has asked the always key question, what could possibly go wrong? But I was looking at what they are proposing to sell. Toulouse sausages, fine, no objection to the Toulouse sausage, indeed would consider myself actively in favour, but microwaved? I mean, French people have rioted over less.
I mean, I've got to say here, I have never used a microwave. We didn't have one in my house. I've literally never used one. So I all I know is I've seen housemates.
Is this some really niche version of the boast, I don't have a television?
No. It's just I've never. My parents never wanted one, never used one. But it's interesting. I once spent 2.5 days on a train actually from LA to Chicago, which was this beautiful journey I did when I was very young, sort of going overland for a month around America. And it was nice to have a separate dining car. I think that is nice. What I will say is, oh my God, is this train interior ugly? It looks like it's been designed by Fisher-Price. Everything is like, it looks awful. Like the dining car seats, it looks like a seat for, I mean, it's all low and weird and it looks like a crash. And the padding on these seats, you can see, and this has been something that's happened in the UK with our rail replacement as well. The padding looks incredibly thin on the seat. It looks like it's got that really horrible LED bright white lighting above it. Why are they sort of doing this to the insides of trains? It's making them really feel quite sort of cheap and nasty.
See, Julia, I'm a massive fan of the idea of railway dining. I love the idea of the dining car, but without exception that I can think of right now, it's almost always been absolutely bloody awful. There's a ridiculous train in Australia between Canberra and Sydney, which is to say the train between our national capital and our biggest commercial centre, which takes more than 4 hours, proceeds at about walking pace, consists of 2 carriages, and does serve food, but it is genuinely completely inedible. And probably the worst meal I've ever eaten in my life, it may not shock you to learn, was served to me in the dining car of a Russian train somewhere between Irkutsk and the Mongolian border. Like, the food was so bad, Russians were complaining about it. Have you had any better experiences than that?
So I sadly have never sat in a... Oh, no, I have actually. No, I did. I went on a Belmont train. Oh, that was gorgeous.
Okay.
That was amazing.
Now I'm jealous. Where was that from or to?
So this is the slightly less glamorous part. Oh. We were going from London to Stoke-on-Trent. But it was beautiful.
Big hello to our listeners in Stoke-on-Trent. Please address your complaints to Julia directly.
We were served beautiful bellinis at 11 o'clock, in which case, after that I proceeded to be quite dozy for the rest of the trip. But it was gorgeous, and we had the most beautiful fabrics all around us, and they were explaining how, like, the interior was this beautiful, like, wood carved, opulence from the 1920s and had been painstakingly restored, and you had beautiful tablecloths. My only other experience is on a Ukrainian train, and there you don't have buffet cars, but what you do have, and this is what I love about being in in Ukraine in summer, is we bring a tablecloth with us, and we have a 4-bunk room. 4-bunk room, and we lay the tablecloth down over the little table that's in between the 2 sets of bunks. And then we wait for every station, and at every station there are sellers who will give you food. Well, obviously for money. But we'll climb out, we'll get watermelons, we'll get sunflower seeds, we'll get juice, we'll get whatever, apples, cucumbers, pears, everything. And obviously it's all been grown in Ukraine, so it's all the most beautiful, delicious food that you could possibly imagine. Ukraine's soil is just the best for growing anything. And then you just proceed to sort of munch on all of this goodness all the way down. And the journey we used to do all the time was down to Crimea to the seaside there. So it was the beginning of my summer holidays, was that beautiful feast of like what had come from the fields and the gardens as the train sort of snaked down. But yes.
Vincent, I was going to ask you for your ultimate dining car experience, but I fear Julia may have set a bar you are not going to clear.
I think she has. I think it's interesting in the coverage as well. The French Transport Minister seems to think he's going to be able to sell a few of these to Britain. Well, one, they're double-decker and we don't have any rail lines that can take double-deckers. And two, we've already got a mess with HS2. Like, we're not going to try and build a TGV anytime this century.
Yeah, but do the French have a bat tunnel? They do not.
Yeah.
They do not. Anyway, it should, you would have thought, have been one of those television events so mercilessly and inescapably advertised in advance that most sane people would have grown furiously sick of it without viewing a minute. An epic adaptation of one of the 20th century's most important and influential novels. Yet Netflix's telling of Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude, released last December, struggled to rack up more than a few million viewers worldwide. It is nevertheless far from the only such endeavour by Netflix, which has also hoovered up the rights to landmark literary works from Mexico, Italy, China and Korea, among other datelines. First obvious question, did anybody watch 100 Years of Solitude? Follow up, had anybody actually heard of it? The series, that is, not the book.
Yeah, I have not even heard about it.
No, nor had I.
Not a moment of advertising for it.
No.
That's extraordinary, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Really, really baffling. Now that you do know it exists, are either of you tempted?
No.
I mean, this is the problem. This is the problem, is that there's just sort of too much. I already have like a shared list with my partner of stuff that we're jointly watching, agreed things I'm not interested in, agreed things they're not interested in, so that you can watch them separately. And then, I mean, if someone gets ahead on a program you're jointly watching, I mean, that is a criminal offense.
Carnage.
Yeah.
That is absolutely. Yeah. But I mean, I don't think this is going to land on my docket. I can see the business strategy that they think, well, there's an inbuilt audience for this kind of stuff. They have had some hits, like One Day, the David Nichols adaptation last year. They sort of didn't do very well on the All the Light We Cannot See adaptation. They're trying to do the Three Body Problems adaptation, but I gave up on that. It was pretty dull. You can see why they're doing it, but ultimately there's just so much content out there that it's not like in the 90s where a sort of famous book, take the BBC adaptation of Pride and Prejudice, which is landmark TV. It gets sold everywhere around the world and generates conversation. You've got to really put the advertising dollars behind it and have huge stars. And this is, of course, in Spanish language, and that isn't a barrier anymore. You've got South Korean shows do incredibly well, but it just feels like it wasn't given any kind of push by the company.
I mean, Julia, are you one of those people who will always harumph through such a thing that it's not as good as the book? Or are you actually quite indulgent of adaptations of things you have read and enjoyed?
No, I'm very snobby.
I'm really pleased to hear that, because I'm very much on the verge of getting angry about Oppenheimer all over again. I mean, having read the actual biography on which it was based, that film, honestly, have you ever been so bored you actually think you're going to start crying? That's where I got. I mean, I was glad neither of you said yes right now, but no, genuinely, I was furious about it. Are there any things either of you would like?
He's adapting The Odyssey now, Christopher Nolan. That's his next thing. That's yeah.
Should I tell you something quite depressing?
Please.
I know quite a few people who now use their phones. They'll put a Netflix show on their phones and then watch it till they fall asleep. So, this is people struggle with insomnia now, and that's a way of curing it. And one thing that really depressed me was there's that really horrid quote that floats around from the Netflix CEO about how they're trying to cure boredom and loneliness in society. And sometimes I do confess, when I get home and I'm all on my own, I do have to put something on, like a show, on in the background, just to have voices talking there so that I can sort of move around my flat and not feel totally alone. But I know that is so insidious.
Yeah, 100 years of solitude is possibly best avoided. Vincent, do you have any that you can think of, televisual adaptations of a thing you had read that you thought, actually, this doesn't suck, it's all right?
I'm going to rename what I did. I loved the David Nichols book One Day, and I didn't enjoy the Anne Hathaway film adaptation, and that was a clear example of it going wrong. But given it the room to breathe in the sort of Netflix adaptation with Ambika Mod and Leo Woodall last year, I thought that was really fantastic. And the Atonement adaptation as well back in the day, the Ian McEwan book. I mean, that was James McAvoy, Keira Knightley. That for me was a sort of perfect adaptation. It's really tricky with the book adaptation because the classic example of the Harry Potter, you just feel like, oh, there's so much that they missed out, and you kind of have to know the book to get things properly. But if it is a shorter book, I think it can really be nailed.
Well, that's 4 stars. Four stars for One Day from Vincent McAvoy.
Trying to condense it down into sort of a 2-hour movie is very different now. And what's interesting about this is that the author said that it had to be 100 hours of TV. Now, Netflix didn't quite go that far after he died. They took it down to 8 hours. But giving the length to breathe in books, it is always a sort of good idea.
Vincent McAvenny and Julia Lassica, thank you both for joining us. Finally, on today's show, our On This Day historical feature reflects on Australia's narrow brush with a hideous mistake. A contention. It is impossible to take altogether seriously a country whose capital city's name is just the name of the country with the word city after it. Yeah, we're looking at you, Mexico, Panama, Guatemala, Kuwait, Djibouti and Luxembourg. And don't think we don't see what Brazil and Algeria are up to with their Brasilia and their Algiers. Like, how does that meeting even go?
Right, we need to call this capital city something. Anyone have any ideas? Ideally something poetic, evocative, uplifting?
This is too hard, and we already spent ages on naming the country. Let's just stick city on the end of that.
Right, let's get lunch. We'll do the flag this afternoon. Probably some stripes or whatever.
On March 12th, 1913, Australia narrowly avoided joining these wretched, ridiculous ranks. 12 years earlier, the colonies of New South Wales, Victoria, Tasmania, Queensland, South Australia and Western Australia had united to become the nation of Australia. A nation needs a national capital, and this nation had 2 obvious rivals for the role. The issue, then as now, was that Sydney thought Melbourne dowdy, fusty, snobbish and damp, and Melbourne thought Sydney was Gomorrah with sunstroke. It was therefore resolved to pick a spot somewhere between them and build a new capital. To forestall anyone getting any funny ideas, this was even included in the fledgling country's constitution, specifically Chapter 7, Clause 125.
The seat of the government of the Commonwealth shall be in the state of New South Wales and be distant not less than 100 miles from Sydney.
So the first task was to decide where exactly to put it. The state of New South Wales, less a 100-mile radius of Sydney, is still handily bigger than France, for example. Though the country they were founding would become synonymous with sunshine, Australia's founders were drawn to cooler climes. This was at least partially at the instigation of the Labour Party MP and Minister for Home Affairs King O'Malley, an eccentric American immigrant who had made a stack in insurance before entering politics. He believed that human history was essentially directed by the great ideas people had when it was too miserable to go outside. It was also on O'Malley's whim that the new Capital Territory would be alcohol-free, they have by now fixed this, and that the Labour Party's name was spelled in the American and incorrect manner without the U. this remains the case. Various sites were advocated: Tumut, Dalgety, Bombala, Bathurst, Wagga Wagga, so good they named it twice, Armidale, Orange. These were rejected as being varying combinations of too bloody cold and too bloody far away. Eventually, everyone agreed on a stretch of sheep paddock on the Monocle River, about 160 miles south of Sydney, 230 miles inland, give or take, certainly hot in the summer, but invigoratingly freezing in the winter. Europeans had been farming there since the 1820s. The English grazier Joshua John Moore, a veteran of the Battle of Waterloo, had owned a property possibly named for a misapprehension of the tribe of the local indigenous people, who were referred to by early colonisers variously as the Gambari, Ngambra and Gnabra. Moore called his homestead Canberra, and Canberra had sort of stuck by way of reference to the general vicinity. It may, or alternatively may not, also be an indigenous word for meeting place. So when this spot was lit upon as the site of Australia's capital, there was an off-the-peg option for the name right there, to spare Australia the eternal odium of being one of those ludicrous countries which names its capital after itself. But people tried. Boo! The government solicited the opinions of the citizenry, which went about as well as this usually does. Fully 764 suggestions were submitted to the Department of Home Affairs, some more serious than others. One correspondent, referring to King O'Malley's prohibition of booze, suggested Thirstyville. Others included Acacia, Aurora, Harmony, Federalia, Eucalypta, Frontierland, Regina, Shakespeare, Captain Cook, Paradise, Olympus, and Aryan City.
Yikes!
This broadcaster will admit to regret that one suggestion, Kookaburra, did not get up to the gate. One correspondent, attempting to please the inhabitants of all the established state capitals, submitted Sidmalad per Brisho. The Prime Minister of the day, Andrew Fisher, for some reason favoured Myola. Legend insists that he let this go when someone noted its overlap with the name of King O'Malley, who Fisher believed full enough of himself as it was. Other close contenders were Southern Cross, after the constellation which appears on Australia's flag, and Parkes, after Sir Henry Parkes, the New South Wales Premier, who had done much to promote federation, even though a town in the state already bore his name. Appallingly, however, when MPs were polled on their preferences, there were big numbers for Austral, Austral City and Australville, all of which suck. Maybe there are those who might argue that preferring Canberra, the name the place pretty much already had, displays at least as grievous a paucity of imagination as naming the capital city after the country, but this is just plain wrong, as all right-thinking people will agree. See? Nevertheless, an amount of tension attended the big reveal on this day 112 years ago. Australia's cabinet had resolved to keep their final decision a closely guarded secret. Lady Denman, wife of the Governor-General, opened the envelope at a ceremonial gathering on what would become known as Capitol Hill, now the site of Parliament House. The plan was that even she would not know what she was going to say until she said it.
I name the capital of Australia Canberra.
It wasn't actually that great a surprise, however. Appropriately for a city whose main industry would be politics, it had already been leaked to the newspapers. For Monocle Radio, I'm Andrew Mueller. And that is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Julia Lassica and Vincent McAvenny. Today's show was produced by Laura Kramer and researched by Francesca Julks. Our sound engineer was Elliot Greenfield. I'm Andrew Mueller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.